My name is Alan Mandell. I'm a faculty member at the State University of New York, Empire State College. I live here in New York City, in the United States. I have been working at Empire State College for many decades now. The focus is on mentoring, the notion of mentoring, of close collaborative relations between faculty and mentors. In fact, every faculty person is called a mentor. We work with adult students. The focus of this is really about learning, about thinking about what learning is. And thus, the focus is necessarily about what transformation refers to. What do we mean when we're talking about learning? Is all learning transformation? What's the difference between learning and transformation? I was very intrigued by these ideas. My background is as a sociologist, but working with adult learners, average age about 36, most of the students thus being in their 40s, the question of what change means to them and what the relationship is between what they learn and whether they change as individuals, as members of a community, as workers, all of those questions were huge and remain huge to me as we fantasize, perhaps, about transformation and probably see much less of it. Many years ago, and I've tried to think about what the origin of this was, I wrote a note to Jack Mesereau. I was interested in the theory. We found each other and I met him many times afterward, trying to talk about what transformational learning meant. Mesereau's work, as I see it, is hugely indebted to the work of the German theorist, political philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And I always took that to be one of the keys, and that's what Mesereau and I talked about. That is, what is the relationship between, I guess, what could be called instrumental learning, communicative learning, and critical learning. Those are real Habermas kinds of distinctions. And I think Jack took this up and tried to translate it into educational theory. My worry has always been, and I'm not alone here, that a terrific amount of the transformational work was focused at the individual level, at the notion of a self and identity and changes of that identity, and not as much focused on what I would think about as systemic, structural dimensions of change, which someone like Habermas, of course, was very, very interested in. Because the notion of the critical side, that third dimension, is really based on being able to see, and Mesereau knew about this, the distortions of understanding that we gain having internalized being a part of a particular society at a particular time. So I think two things about what needs to happen. One, I worry that the notion of transformation has almost like ideological proportions, that people think about it almost as an ideology, that it has this emotional tone to it. And I think that that's problematic because I think change is very, very difficult. I think change doesn't only exist at the individual level, but needs to exist also at this contextual social level. And I guess the final thing I would say about it is there is probably less transformation than we fantasize there would be. So I worry about the kind of romance of transformational learning and think we have to pay real attention to when it occurs and why it often doesn't. One of the great things about adult learning theory about adult learning practice, about working with adults, I think, is that the question of what do we mean by learning has never gone away. Much of the work that I have been involved in over the years has been about experiential learning and has been about prior learning assessment and being able to identify what students already know, learning that has not occurred within the academy. All of this stuff, all of this focus, as I said, on learning means, what does transformation mean? What is the relationship between, as I said, between learning and transforming? And I think that continues to be a huge need. I think that the theory that Mesereau tried to develop needs further elaboration. And I also think, I said this to somebody yesterday, I think Jack Mesereau, as I knew him, and many people obviously knew and worked with him better than I did, I think he was a pretty humble guy. I saw him in front of, I invited him to my college. He talked to faculty members. He was humble about this theory. I don't think he had some notion that he had it, that this was the theory to be unmoved. It has to be moved. It has to be rethought. And I think especially we need to think about this category, for me, about what distorted communication refers to. That's a big, audacious notion. And I think that transformational theory, critical educational theory, has to think about this notion of distortion so as not to be in a situation where we are imposing what we think is true on people who we think don't think clearly, carefully, adequately enough. I think that's our big challenge. I guess I would say there are a couple of levels of this, but here's the most important one to me. Most of my work as an educator over the years has been working one-on-one with students, sitting there in a room at a table with somebody who's a couple of feet away from me. It's a very, very unique way of thinking about experiencing learning. And it also, at its best, means that a student is able to be taken seriously, is able to express something about what he or she knows, skills gained. I think there have been many moments of what I think transformation is too grandiose. I think it's mini insights, little epiphanies, where somebody is able to connect that person's personal experience, history, as a learner, as a person, as a member of a community, as a member of a family, to connect that to something that they are learning. It's a moment of insight. It's a moment of thinking about themselves as having more autonomy, or thinking about themselves as, I guess what I would think of as idea makers. They are immediately saying, I am not stupid. I am not without ideas. I have insights. And I think that idea, that experience of taking oneself seriously in a way that many people have not taken themselves seriously, or in saying, wow, I have learned something, I am capable, I have competence. That's a kind of transformative moment that I think can really ripple through somebody's experience. I guess I would just say one other thing, my second example. I think that that first thing occurs often. Whether it takes, I think this is another big issue of what research has to take up, What does transformation look like in 5 years, in 10 years? What does that student think about herself 15 years after having that experience in an academic institution? I think that's really valuable to ask. I work a lot with faculty, doing faculty development. I think the same situation exists. We are astonishingly embedded in and reliant on taken for granted understandings of how to teach, what a student is, what our discipline is, all of those things. And I think that obviously these meaning schemes are internalized and really, really, really difficult to change. And I think that part of the process of faculty development and some of the things that Mesereau's work urges us to do is to find situations in which we can identify what those taken for granted are and begin to unpack them in some way so we can begin to see the strengths and the limitations of what we take for granted. That is huge, because I think, again, our embeddedness in a language, in a way of thinking, in a way of acting, in a way of imagining our authority, our embeddedness in this is huge. And we have to find a way to prompt ourselves to wonder about it and perhaps to think anew. I think it's a great opportunity to hear and share with people who are also committed to wondering about their ideas and who, I think, want to change the world. I mean, I think that that's what's really interesting about this transformative education movement. I'd call it a movement. I think that that's what Jack's work, Jack Mesereau's work, really tried to initiate. It's a movement about change. It's a movement about changing attitudes, and where it gets harder, it's a movement about changing institutional ways. And I think it's a great opportunity for people to be together. And I guess I would just hope that we use the time to question some of our understandings of what transformation is, rather than just intoning the word as it's a kind of emotional something that we can hold on to. We've got to find ways to question it ourselves, to ask, how are we using the notion of transformational learning itself as a kind of authority, which blocks our ability to ask new questions, to relate to each other in different ways, and to ask how we can be effective social and educational changers.